When we examine the 19th century, one of the most striking developments is the dramatic expansion of European empires across the globe. While European powers had maintained overseas colonies for centuries, the scale and intensity of imperial expansion in the late 19th century was unprecedented. By the early 20th century, European states controlled vast portions of Africa and Asia, fundamentally reshaping global political and economic systems. What is important to recognize here is that this period of imperial expansion did not emerge suddenly or without context. Rather, it developed at the intersection of several major transformations occurring in Europe during the 19th century. Industrialization had reshaped economies, nationalism was redefining political identities, and new technologies were dramatically altering the ways in which states could protect power across long distances. As a result, imperial expansion became deeply entwined with the broader competition between European states. Empires were no longer simply sources of trade or missionary activity, they were increasingly becoming symbols of national prestige and strategic influence. When we place this development within the broader historical context, it becomes clear that the 19th century imperialism was not driven by a single motive. Instead, it emerged from a combination of economic interest, political rivalries, cultural ideologies, and technological capabilities. The Scramble for Africa offers perhaps the clearest example of how these factors converged. So let's talk about the Scramble for Africa. One of the most dramatic manifestations of 19th century imperialism was the rapid partition of Africa by European powers during the late 19th century. Historians often refer to this process as the Scramble for Africa, a term used to describe the intense competition among European states to claim territory across the continent. Interestingly, prior to the 1870s, much of Africa remained outside direct European political control. European influence had largely been confined to coastal trading posts and limited settlements. Interior regions were controlled by powerful African states and societies, many of which maintained their own political systems, trade networks, and military structures. However, within just a few decades, roughly between 1880 and 1914, the situation changed dramatically. By the outbreak of the First World War, nearly the entire continent had been divided among European empires. The speed of this transformation is remarkable. In just over 30 years, European powers claimed millions of square miles of territory and brought tens of millions of people under colonial rule. The rapid expansion raises an important question. Why did the scramble occur when it did? To answer this question, we need to examine several overlapping motives that drove imperial expansion during the 19th century. One of the most commonly cited explanations for imperialism focuses on economic factors. The 19th century was a period of rapid industrialization in Europe. Factories required vast quantities of raw materials, and industrial economies increasingly depended on global trade networks. As industrial production expanded, European states began searching for new sources of resources, such as rubber, cotton, palm oil, minerals, and other commodities. Africa appeared to offer enormous economic potential. However, it is important to approach this explanation carefully. While economic interests certainly played a role in imperial expansion, historians often caution against reducing imperialism to purely economic motivations. Many colonies were not immediately profitable. In fact, maintaining colonial administrations could be quite expensive. Infrastructure projects, military garrisons, and bureaucratic structures required significant investment. Nevertheless, imperial advocates often believed that colonies would eventually provide economic benefits. Colonies could supply raw goods, serve as markets for manufactured goods, and offer investment opportunities for European capital. As a result, economic arguments frequently appeared in political debates surrounding imperial expansion, even when the actual economic benefits still remained uncertain. Another important factor behind imperial expansion was the growing influence of nationalism during the 19th century. By this period, European states increasingly viewed empire as a measure of national strength and prestige. Possessing overseas colonies signaled that a nation was powerful, modern, and capable of competing on the global stage. When we examine imperial expansion from this perspective, it becomes clear that imperialism was closely tied to rivalries between European powers. States feared that if they did not claim territory, their rivals would. This competitive dynamic helps explain the rapid pace of territorial expansion during the Scramble for Africa. Once several European states began claiming territories, others felt compelled to follow in order to avoid falling behind. This result was a form of geopolitical competition that extended far beyond Europe itself. This dynamic became particularly evident during the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, where European powers met to establish rules for territorial claims in Africa. Interestingly, no African representatives were present at this conference, despite the fact that the decisions being made would dramatically reshape the political future of their continent. The conference did not divide Africa entirely, but it did establish principles that encouraged further territorial expansion. European powers agreed that claims to African territory required effective occupation, meaning that states had to establish some form of administrative presence on the ground. This rule, intended to prevent conflicts between European powers, ironically accelerated that scramble itself. Another key factor that made imperial expansion possible during the 19th century was technological change. Advances in transportation, medicine, and military technology dramatically improved European states' ability to project power overseas. For example, the development of steamships made travel along African rivers and coastlines far more efficient than earlier sailing vessels. Steam power allowed European explorers, traders, and military forces to penetrate regions that had previously been difficult to access. Similarly, the invention of quinine, a treatment for malaria, significantly reduced the risks faced by Europeans traveling in tropical regions. Prior to this medical breakthrough, disease had been one of the most significant barriers to Europeans' expansions into the African interior. Military technology also played an important role. Weapons such as the Maxim gun, one of the first fully automatic machine guns, gave European armies overwhelming firepower in conflicts with local forces. These technological advances did not eliminate resistance from African societies. Many resisted colonial expansion fiercely, but they did shape the balance of power significantly. As a result, technological developments made imperialist conquest far more feasible than it had been in earlier centuries. While economic and political motives played significant roles in imperial expansion, imperialism was also supported by a set of cultural and ideological beliefs that attempted to justify empire. One of the most influential of these ideas was the concept often referred to as the civilizing mission. Many Europeans believed that their societies represented a more advanced stage of human development. As a result, imperial expansion was sometimes framed as an effort to bring civilization, Christianity, education, and modern institutions to other parts of the world. Missionaries played an important role in spreading these ideas. Christian missionary societies were active throughout Africa and Asia during the 19th century, establishing schools, churches, and hospitals. However, it is important to recognize that these beliefs were often deeply intertwined with racial hierarchies and that emerged during this period. Pseudoscientific theories about race became influential throughout the 19th century, reinforcing the idea that Europeans were inherently superior to other peoples. These ideas helped legitimize imperial expansion in the eyes of many Europeans, even when imperial rule involved significant exploitation and violence. When we analyze these ideological justifications, we begin to see how imperialism was not simply a political or economic policy. It was deeply embedded within a broader cultural assumption about progress, civilization, and global hierarchy. It is also important to remember that the Scramble for Africa was not simply a story of European expansion. African societies were active participants in this historical moment, and many resisted imperial conquest. Several African states mounted significant military resistance to European expansion. For example, the Ethiopian Empire successfully resisted Italian colonization during the Battle of Adwa in 1896, one of the most important African victories against European imperial forces. Similarly, leaders such as Samori Touré in West Africa organized sustained resistance against French expansion. These examples remind us that imperial conquest was often contested and difficult. European expansion was not inevitable, nor was it uncontested. The consequences of 19th century imperialism were profound and long-lasting. European colonial rule reshaped political boundaries across Africa, often drawing borders that ignored existing ethnic, linguistic, and political divisions. Colonial economies were reorganized to prioritize the extraction of resources for global markets. Infrastructure such as railroads and ports were frequently constructed, but these systems were designed primarily to support imperial economic interests. At the same time, colonial rule disrupted existing social and political structures, often imposing new administrative systems that concentrated power in the hands of colonial authorities. These transformations would have long-lasting effects well into the 20th century, shaping patterns of economic development, political conflict, and global inequality. When we step back and examine the scramble for Africa within the broader history of the 19th century, it becomes clear that imperialism was the result of multiple overlapping forces. Economic interests, nationalistic rivalries, technological innovations, and cultural ideologies all contributed to the expansion of European empires. Importantly, imperialism was not simply about territory or resources, it was also reflected how 19th century Europeans understood their place in the world and their relationship to other societies. Studying imperialism, therefore, allows us to better understand the global transformations that reshape political power, economic systems, and cultural interactions during the modern era. In many ways, the legacy of the 19th century imperialism continued to influence global relationships today. Understanding this period helps us to see how the structures of the modern world emerged and how they were reshaped by the ambitions, conflicts, and assumptions of the 19th century.